Dr. Jayprakash Narayan is a physician by training and served as a member of the Indian Administrative Services for 16 years. He also started the Foundation for Democratic Reforms, FDR, and the Lok Satta Party, a people's movement for governance and political reforms. He has been a long-time supporter of liberal ideas and is also a CCS board member. It's a pleasure having you with us, sir.
Friends, happy Independence Day to all of you, and let me extend my very warm greetings on the 23rd anniversary of this wonderful organization. I'm normally not nostalgic. I'm not given to looking back too much or reflecting on autobiographical details. But today, as you guys were going through your evolution and your experience of the past 23 years, I was very quickly reflecting. My journey started 46 years ago as a youngster in medical school, when I saw the contrast between what happened in the Watergate and post-Watergate phase in the United States, how a mighty president was felled by the institutions which had the strength to hold power to account, and how in our country, by the time many of you, or perhaps even your parents were not born at the time, we had a government about which the illusions were lost and people were angry and upset, and yet we could not hold the government account despite massive public pressure and great movements. Ultimately, emergency was declared and the whole nation was converted to some kind of a jail. Then about a year before you all guys started CCS, I left government and I founded FDR, Foundation of Democratic Reforms. And in the year you founded CCS, I founded Lok Satta movement. The party came much later. As somebody who has founded institutions, quite a few of them, I understand the excitement, the pain, the anguish, the glory of success, and the trials and tribulations. And I share in your joy, and I'm a great admirer of the work that you have been doing over the years. I think it's very difficult to exhibit high degree of fidelity to certain ideas consistently, and then apply your mind and then innovate and find realistic solutions in a context. That's what CCS has been doing with great success. And thank you for the work you're doing. And I salute you for your courage, for your integrity, for your innovation. Parth, when he called me, he didn't tell me that it was a foundation day, actually. He said, basically, shall we have some kind of a conversation to lift the mood? There is some amount of despondency thanks to COVID and many other things. Can we have a conversation to reflect on the positives now? So let me very briefly mention a few things, and if you have time, maybe you can have a few questions, otherwise we can move on. I'm often reminded of Gandhiji's talisman, and in many ways, as Parth said, Gandhi, Rajaji, and Tagore, this triumvirate has a great deal to offer to our country. Gandhiji's talisman is something that inspires everybody, but many people confuse what he said. He did not say, help that fellow, that poor fellow in the farthest corner in that hut. He said, if what you do gives him a measure of control over his life, then that is worth doing. But if it makes him more dependent, does not give him greater control over his life, then it's not worth doing. I think that is the essence of liberalism. How do you give control to the individual over his or her own life, rather than giving up the control to somebody else? But in order to apply it to the contemporary Indian context, I would say broadly there are three mantras. One issue that always bothers me is that much of our debate in India is divorced from realities. Without understanding the role of the state in the modern context, without defining it very clearly, rigorously, and judging the role of the state or the efficacy of the state on objective criteria, we cannot really go ahead anywhere. So the role of the state, we all know what it is. I'm sure some of us will debate. For instance, I passionately believe directly or indirectly the state has a central role in promoting school education and quality healthcare. There are others who would disagree. But fundamentally, we have to define the role of the state and then start judging and then figuring out what are the things to be done by the state and by the market and so on and so forth. The second mantra to me is the principle of subsidiarity. The the political or the social component of liberalism is subsidiarity. Unless power and decision making are exercised at a level closest to the people as far as practicable, you cannot really have a liberal society. You can have authoritarian societies which are quite efficient. China is pretty efficient in many ways, but that's not liberal society. That's not liberalism by any stretch of imagination. And that means in a democratic context, there must be a clear link between the vote that we give and the consequences that visit on us as voters. Only then will there be mature voting and democracy will succeed, because democracy, we all know, is a tough system to operate. There must be a clear link between the taxes that we pay and the services we receive, though we all understand that there are certain services that cannot be directly impacting the citizens. There is an indirect impact. I don't think many citizens understand what a Federal Reserve is or a central bank is in a country, or perhaps the national defense is and many other stuff. But to the extent practical, we must bring synergy between the taxes and services. And finally, between authority and accountability. The more divorced authority is, the less accountability is likely to be. And the more disconnected authority is from accountability, you have a system of alibis, a system of failure, a system of tyranny, a system of arbitrariness. And all of us in India are all too familiar with these consequences. And the third mantra, to my mind, is something that liberals don't always say often enough: harmony. While for us, individual liberty is important, it cannot be isolated from societal good. Therefore, the links and the interconnectedness between the individual, the society, and nature, if we do not explore them and emphasize them often enough, and do not allow them to play a role in our minds in pursuing our goals, I think then there's something amiss. In other words, what I'm urging is that we must go a little beyond the puritanical philosophy. I was struck by what Parth was saying. Unless we cede the moral, unless we reclaim the moral high ground, if we cede the moral high ground to the socialists and the collectivists, then we lost the battle and the war both. And ultimately, it's not about merely an idea. It's about the outcomes to the people. A society that does not give opportunity to every single child in the form of quality education, irrespective of circumstances of birth and economic status, and a society that does not eliminate avoidable suffering without having to pay out of pocket, if we really propose goals independent of people's lives, then after a point we lose steam and we lose heart ourselves. And therefore, unless we have certain yardsticks, are we enhancing liberty or not? Are we promoting harmony or not? Are we improving the quality of life or not? In the absence of a very definitive, affirmative answers to these questions, our work, our lives, our philosophy will be devoid of legitimacy. They'll become ethereal, they'll become elitist, they'll become inconsequential to the public, and ultimately that will lead to democratic perversions, as we're seeing in many countries in the world today. So how do we cope? Let me state a few rules of thumb, and then I'll conclude. The first is, every day we must remind ourselves that democracy is tough. It's a miracle. That actually millions of people who do not know each other, who have different backgrounds in a very diverse society, that we all actually come together, elect some people on our behalf as representatives to make decisions for us, to manage the public affairs, the collective affairs on our behalf, and that we do it peacefully, that we do it in an orderly manner, and that some of the decisions actually are sensible, some are not so sensible, but on the whole, the system is relentlessly on a march. It's a remarkable thing anywhere in the world. Democracy is a tough operation. We have to be patient. We have to be respectful. We must not take it for granted. Again, who would have imagined, and as somebody whose formative years were during the Watergate scandal and so on and so forth, it's impossible to believe what we see today in the United States, for instance, or elsewhere. Things which we thought were impossible in certain societies are now beginning to appear to be pretty normal. We cannot take things for granted, no matter what level of evolution your democracy is in. We have to continuously nurture it. We have to recognize it's always an unfinished work. We must be patient, and we must never throw the baby with the bathwater. The second is, for us who are seeking change, we must have the humility to recognize that very often it's not really our efforts alone, it's the power of the context. Now, long years ago, when I was listening to a brilliant series of lectures, Wreath Memorial Lectures by Sir Douglas Voss on BBC, in one of the lectures, he said, at the end of the day, it's not a bureaucrat who really makes a difference. It's the enlightened public opinion. It's the free and enlightened media. It's the opposition. He mentioned all those things. And then finally he said, and the force of circumstances. As a young man, an arrogant and somewhat enthusiastic young man, I thought, what's this old fogey saying? I mean, what is the force of circumstance? Everything else is obvious, but why force of circumstances? Now, as an older man and hopefully wiser man, I realized that they perhaps shape events much more than any other agency, the force of circumstances. And if we are smart, in our quest to engineer change of the kind that we believe in, we must utilize the force of circumstances. For instance, 1991, we all know. It did not happen because a group of economists or the finance minister or the prime minister or a ruling party or some other, or the parliament came together and decided that no, in a rational and evidence-based manner, India requires economic liberalization. No, it was the force of circumstances. And because a few wise people used that diligently and systematically, though in a narrow field, only to a limited extent, but to that limited extent in a thorough manner, India achieved at least some significant results. The force of circumstances, never underestimate them. For instance, 2G spectrum, one of the smaller accomplishments in my life has been to get cancellation of the 2G spectrum licenses and ensure that there is on a perpetual basis competitive bidding for allocation of natural resources. But without the context, without the anger that the people exhibited on account of the enormous corruption that was proven or assumed on account of the CAG's report, it could not have happened. The context, the power of the context. Similarly, COVID gives us certain opportunities. Maybe healthcare, maybe big city management, maybe the supply chains, and education. Somebody is talking about education policy. So the power of the context is perhaps our greatest ally. Oftentimes we tend to forget that, and therefore nimble-footedness, the ability to very quickly adapt to circumstances and utilize the context to serve the purpose that we have been working for is, I think, critical in achieving significant change. The third is, as theoreticians, we tend to have a laundry list, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's all nice to have that. But in real life, you have to have a sense of critical levers of change. You'll never get all the things that you want. And sometimes if you actually endeavor to get all those things, you may get them in a rotten way because you lose the sense of what's important, what's unimportant. You have to look at the critical change. Take, for instance, education policy. There are many things there, but to me, the most important thing is once you actually start defining success and measuring success by sensible evaluation, in a society like ours, everything else falls into place. The public sector, private sector, everything becomes inconsequential. The people, the stakeholders, we must remember, there are millions of stakeholders who want something for their children. The kids want something for their lives. Once you design the critical levers, operate in the critical levers and alter one critical incentive, everything else falls in place. Instead of looking at 25 issues, 25, very detailed laundry list and a planned kind of an approach, the critical levers approach, that's more likely to yield greater success, though it requires a lot of strategic thinking. The fourth is, it's always a difficult choice in a modern society, which is very noisy. As Mark Twain said once, often a hen that only laid an egg cackles as if she's laid an asteroid. So it's very easy to try and blow a trumpet. But I cannot help thinking that there's almost always a trade-off between genuine accomplishment and the glory that you get. And unless you're willing to forsake the glory, give the glory to others, we cannot really be partners in achieving big change. And finally, the other day somebody said, I think Bill Gates said, and I'm impressed by the particular point he made, we often, almost always, overestimate our capacity to bring about big changes in the short term and underestimate our ability to transform societies in the long term. In 1 year, 2 years, we think, no, big things will happen. Oftentimes we are found wrong. And in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, we always think, no, nothing much changes. Not true. If we have the smartness, if even a significant trajectory change is there, though it appears to be relatively small in the short term, but in 10, 15 years' time, there are profound consequences. Time and again, we have seen that whenever big change happened over a long period of time. We live in a glorious age. We have fantastic opportunity today. I'm a great optimist. You show me the darkest cloud, I tend to see the silver lining rather than the cloud. Because we have technology, we have resources, we have best practices, we have cumulative wisdom, we have ability to network, we have synergies, we have many, many things. We have to believe passionately that while mankind as a whole is not always smart in the short term, they don't always know what is in their best interest. In every society, this is true time and again. They're always enlightened individuals who can see farther ahead than most of their fellow human beings. And this is important, even if there's resistance in the short term, eventually when the people see the truth of this argument by their own experience, not by theoretical arguments, but by their own experience, when they see that it's actually beneficial to them, they will stand by you. It may take a little longer sometimes. It may happen a little faster on occasion. But invariably, mankind has the capacity, or humankind has the capacity to verify the truth, the smartness to recognize the collective self-interest and to embrace that. And in a broader sense of history, it is that belief, that faith, and that understanding of the longer trajectory of human history that should give us hope. That should give us a smile. That should make us cheerful in the very difficult task that we have consciously, voluntarily chosen to embark upon. And therefore, a bit of sense of humor, a bit of sense of history, and a zest for life. I think without these, if we're much too serious and much too wonk-like and much too nerd-like, and however focused we are, however worthy that goal is, perhaps that's not the best way to lead lives. You've all been doing a fantastic job. There's so much more to do in our country. But luckily, there's so much more that is possible with relative ease because we are at a level of 20. To reach 40 or 50 from 20 is relatively easy. Even if in some sectors we don't see immediate change, in some other sectors, like for instance, education, now there's a promising opportunity. There could well be significant change, even if it's not perfect. It's pretty good. It's pretty decent. Let's not make the impossible best enemy of the possible good. In some other sector, it may be a little later. But eventually, we'll get there if you know exactly what we want. It's like an architect who has tremendous clarity about what is to be done, but this architect doesn't have the luxury of deciding the sequence of the structure. Sometimes a column will come, sometimes a beam will come, sometimes something else will come. But the architect must figure out where, when, what will fit. And eventually see that the structure is as complete and as harmonious and as stable as is humanly possible. That's the nature of reform, because as Machiavelli of all people said, and that's something that always reminds me of the difficulties of transformation in any society, he said, a reformer must have infinite patience. Mahatma Gandhi actually said this. A reformer must have infinite patience. And Machiavelli gave the reasoning. He said, a reformer encounters, I'm paraphrasing his words, a reformer encounters the assured enmity of the powerful few who know what is at stake, and receives lukewarm support of the weak multitudes who do not understand always what is at stake. That is the nature of reform, political, economic, or social. But it's a goal worth pursuing. You have been doing it with great perspicacity, with great love and passion, with great innovation and ingenuity. And I believe that thanks to your efforts, there are many more people who are now primed to these ideas and are willing to embrace these ideas and willing to let the results flow from these ideas put into operation. Thank you for that work. Once again, happy Independence Day and happy Foundation Day. Thank you.